And I was like, wow, this is ridiculous. And the guy was saying, well, with the flush system, there's very little odor, very little smell. However, the feed that they were giving the pigs, they still stunk. And they were all enclosed. It was indoor. It wasn't outdoor. It wasn't fresh air. And they fed them pure grain. That's all it was. It was a pelleted feed. And when you touch them, you got to move them. And we did a lot of processes. We did artificial insemination and all different things that typical of your Western non-Korean farming practices. And I would pushing them through, and could smell my hands, right? And they had, they have that film on them, and that smell would be on my hands for days. Is that would you was that the same way with Korean natural?
No, no, not at all. And I've proven the system 5 times over, meaning I built pens not according to spec as far as what was taught and what is even published. Um, I um I don't know if you ever seen schematics on um building a pen, but and even the deep litter system, they say dig however many feet, put logs, and then put green waste or mulch. You know, I've never dug ever. I don't have machines. So it's all above ground. My very first one I did logs, again, just keep it in keeping with the whatever, put mulch on it. It worked. And then I built, like I said, 5 other ones. Um, and again, all above ground. And then the last one I built, I had maybe a foot of logs, or uh, they're not even big logs. They're not quite twigs, but in between the log size and twigs, and maybe about 6 to 8 inches of mulch. That's it. And I did AI, and of course, I don't know if you do AI in Hawaii, you have to get a permit with the Department of Ag, or yeah, Department of Ag. And part of um that process is you need to be inspected by the state by the state vet, if you're doing AI. So,
Really?
yeah, so because once you order semen, you're automatically registered in their log or registry or whatever. Because getting semen is not that simple. Like, you gotta apply for a permit and all that. So anyway, so state vet came, and they deemed our operation acceptable. I mean, granted, it was only one pig by that time, but they were standing next to it. They couldn't even tell where it was. There
Right
was
on.
a
Yeah.
high guinea grass covering it, and they were like, "Okay, let's go. Where's the pig? Let me take a look." And I said, "Oh, right here." So minimal flies, no smell. I mean, when I say no smell, you know what that smell is, but
Yeah.
none of that smell. So,
Yeah. Yeah. It's a
um,
very pungent. Yeah. Yeah.
right.
So,
Um,
ammonia.
e right. Even the very first piggery I visited, the very first one they put together in Kurdistan, uh, which personally I think is overkill, but it proved its point, and I was sold. Um, you can smell the animals for sure, but not the traditional piggery smell, so to speak. Um, so yeah, so I incorporated a lot of the principles with the chickens, especially when we had the layers. It's such a simple um method, and really same principle as the with the piggery that you used to work at, with the bacteria doing most of the work, or the microorganisms doing most of the work. So
Can you go in a
So
little
yeah.
bit of detail into your like as much as you're comfortable with going into the detail of how you set up your layers and then as you went into your broiler operation and how you incorporated that Korean natural farming into your broiler operation, if at all.
So with the layers, we again, we did a dry litter system. It's not a deep litter system because it's not really deep. It's, all you needed was, a couple inches of mulch or green waste. Um, and you don't even really need to inoculate it. I learned years later. You know, lactic acid bacteria is endemic everywhere. So whether we like it or not, everything is covered with lactic acid bacteria. It's just maybe, if the system is inundated, um, you might need to inoculate just to get it going. But for the most part, if your flock size is relative to the size of, the coop, I think the system will just balance itself out. So um, that's why I said like, inoculating might not be necessary, with microorganisms, because like I said, they're already there. And if you're putting natural material in it, chances are, all the microorganisms are already present. Um, so again, with the chicken laying operation, egg laying operation, no smell. Um, the only time you smell manure is when the chicken poop. Literally, as soon as it comes out, definitely smell it, but never overwhelming. It usually take a couple hours and then gone. Um, so we increased the flock from 50 to 200 at one point. Um, Same result. Of course, I don't know anything about chicken health or anything like that at that point. So we were just kind of doing whatever. Um, we were feeding the hens with formulated feed. So, no guesswork there, um, to a certain extent. And so we were getting the results we wanted. We're getting eggs. Um, and then when it came down to the broilers, uh, a little bit different setup because we were doing pasture raised, using Joel Salatin's method of having coops, and then we're moving the coops. So we didn't need to have a dry litter system, obviously. It's hard to pull off if you're moving, just too much work. However, one of the things we learned in Korean natural farming is making lactic acid bacteria serum. So we were using that to, um, we were spraying the manure with that serum after we moved the coop to a new location. So the previous location, we spray it, and we still do till this day, helps mitigate flies, and also it hastens the breakdown of the manure. Um, and so I think that's about it. I tried to put some of the inputs that we learned into their drinking water, thinking like maybe it will, help supplement with some probiotics or whatever, but it's hard to quantify only because, the broilers are, they're gone after 6 to 8 weeks. So if there is anything there, like I said, it's so hard to quantify. Um, and the problem is, our um, the water is static. We don't have any way to bubble it or aerate it. So after a couple days, that water with some of that inputs, it goes bad. It goes rancid or it goes, anaerobic pretty quick. So not necessarily good for for the chickens. And so uh, our Korean natural farming methods as far as broilers is limited to just spraying with lactic acid bacteria. However, as far as us raising, I can't even say it's Korean natural farming style. Um, I just had a class recently. I was teaching a poultry production class, and I was telling the guys, it's funny, we're trying to mimic nature by raising these chickens, but I said, uh, everything that we're doing is so unnatural. Meaning, you know, if you look in nature, you look at the feral chickens, they don't do this. This is not normal behavior for chickens. We're doing production work. Um, and, I said, uh, our mortality rate is about 10%. And I said, if you look at nature, mortality rate for chickens is 90%, you know. Um, and I asked them, have you guys ever observed a hen with little baby chicks, feral chickens, like running around? I said, if you ever do, I said, um, keep keep observing for like a few days. I said they might start off with 10 chicks. By the end, they'll probably only have like one or two. That's typical of nature. That's how it is. And so what we're doing is very unnatural, even though, you know, uh, we're trying to mimic how natural things are. I mean, kind of ironic, but of course, this is a livelihood. Uh, so that being said, we try to. So, and I said, instead of thinking at it as doing the most natural way, we're um I look at it as caring for the animals as best we could, provide them as much care and love, uh, you know, even though no matter how corny that sounds, we try to provide that level of care so that way, we're honoring, their sacrifice.
Right
So
on. Like so, if I could jump in, the way that and this is goes across all meat production, animal production. We are definitely controlling the environment that they're in. However, like you're saying, if they were out in nature, they'd be subjected to many more um, fatal things like disease, predator, lack of food. So when they're out in the wild or in the environment, they're looking for food all the time. We're providing food for them. Their food might be nutrient deficient. We're providing, in some cases, formulated food with the quote unquote optimal nutrition with the appropriate micronutrients and macros. And they're living in an environment that is protected and they're sheltered because we're caring for them, because we're actually, I mean, we're getting a benefit from them. And I would argue to say that most producers from beef to maybe even like rabbits care enough about their animal to make sure that they're healthy, to make sure that they're raised well, and that they have a product and animals that are healthy and full and strong and robust, and not full of cancers, not full of um, you know different type of toxins, right? And so a lot of people might, well, some people might disagree that it's inhumane in some ways that we produce our food, and I wouldn't argue that to some extent. However, if the animals were out in the wild, a lot of them they will die from starvation, from a predator, and they don't die fast. We call fast, right? We do it in a way that minimizes the stress and harm to the animal. A wolf is not doing that. A mongoose is not doing that. They're eating the guts first while the
Right.
chicken is still looking, right? That's the reality of nature. So what you're saying is right, is yeah, you're that's the reality of it, right? It is fake. Our environment is fake. It's made up, but it doesn't have to necessarily be that because you're putting in management practices that try to mimic as much natural as possible so that the birds are can behave more like birds, but then we can have an end product that is healthy and nutritious to us.
Right. Right. And it's funny too, you know, people assume like, birds eating bugs and grass, um, it's such a great thing. But they don't understand that they can only eat so much if we're gonna eat them. Because like you said, if there was anything there that could be detrimental to us, well, guess what? If the chicken is eating it, we might get it too. You know, I had a lady tell me or ask me, I said, "Oh, what about feral chickens?" And I said, "Yeah, you're taking a chance with that, because if what if they had a disease and it happens to transfer to us?" And then she goes, "You know what? Yeah, I do remember like I saw this feral chicken once and it had this worms on its eyes." I said, "Yeah, imagine, um, some of those bacteria or microorganism can live, in the carcass even after you cook them at a certain temperature, and so yeah, it's just risky. And so actually FDA require that any feed that you feed to an animal that is to be consumed by humans, cannot have over 2% of ingredients that is not uh feed stuff or is consumable by humans. So because people ask me all the time, like, "Oh, does your chicken eat bugs?" And I'm like, I think so, but I I don't make them they have the option to do that if they see it and if it comes across in their face and if they want it. But for the most part, we feed them the formulated feed because we want to produce a product that is wholesome for human consumption.
I know.
So yeah, it's you don't want to disappoint these people, but at the same time, you got to give them a dose of reality.
Yeah, reality doesn't necessarily mean they're happy about it.
Right, right.